morning I want to lay out an argument that I hope will arrest you, provoke you, so that we shall, after half an hour or so, have what will be a lively and spirited exchange. And of course it focuses on the issue of animals, and in particular the issue of animal suffering and the question why, if at all, does animal suffering matters. Well, the inspiration for my presentation this morning is a remark from one of my colleagues at Oxford. I'm sure you're all aware about how learned and impressive colleagues sometimes make comments that are, how shall we say, vexing or irksome. And I had the misfortune, I think in the end the fortune, to have a colleague who, whenever any really important issue was raised about children or women or animals, he always used to say, well, this is an emotional issue. Emotional issue. Well, of course, the issue of animal cruelty is an emotional issue. Most people do feel very moved by pictures and images of cruelty to animals or indeed to any other creature. But that's, of course, not what he meant. What he meant is that the animal issue is just emotion. It's how you feel. It's about taste. You like ice cream, I like fox hunting. It's about taste, it's not about reason. And indeed, you may have noticed that the media often harp on this aspect by referring to animal lovers, or those people who are sentimental about animals, or those who are squeamish. What I want to suggest is that the boot is actually on the other foot. But first, a couple of definitions. What do I mean by suffering? Well, by suffering, I do not simply mean physical cruelty. I mean a variety of emotions, a variety of sensations, mental as well as physical. Pain, shock, fear, foreboding, anticipation, stress, actually trauma and terror. Now, there is already a great deal of evidence, scientific evidence, in peer-reviewed scientific journals to show that all mammals, and birds at least, I realise there are other beings about which questions may be asked, but certainly when it comes to mammals and birds, that they experience this wide range of sensations. Now, this isn't something I have made up. It's now well established in the literature, and is in fact as reasonable as supposing that children or adult human beings suffer. So that's my definition of suffering, not just physical cruelty, as will become apparent. Secondly, by animals here, I mean the more narrow definition of mammals and birds, where this sentiency, this capacity for suffering and, well, sapience, intelligence too, can be reasonably supposed, at least to a greater or lesser extent as it can be in the case of human beings. Many people who want to justify our maltreatment of animals, or indeed our use of animals generally, usually argue that animals are different from us. This is the stock argument. They're different from us, Andrew. Well, of course they are different from us. There are differences between and within all species. Of course there is. And the word animal, in fact, covers, even within mammalian and bird life, a huge range of possibilities and sensations. But this is often coupled with a further thought that not only are they different from us, but they don't feel like us. They don't have the capacity to suffer in the same way that humans do. And therefore it is commonly supposed that human suffering is, as it were, self-evidently more important. Self-evidently. It's so self-evident that we don't even call it into question. It's as though there's this huge thing, important self-evident thing called human suffering. This is the really important first-class kind of suffering. And then there's something called animal suffering down here, which, we have to take account of it, but, it's nothing in comparison with the importance of human suffering. Now, what I want to do this morning is to offer an analysis of what this difference is and what it amounts to morally. In other words, I want to ask the question, are these differences morally relevant? Now, forgive me if this all sounds really rather academic, but there's a very practical point to all this. Supposing, for example, you're a teacher and you find that in your playground there are 2 or 3 people beating up on another little boy or girl. And you say, well, why are you doing this? And the bullies say, well, it's because he's got ginger hair. Well, surely this would strike you as strange. Not that the boy or the girl had done something wrong, had pinched some of their chocolate or some of their candy, but that there was, a non-morally relevant difference. Or that someone wore glasses, or that someone had a black skin, or that someone had a different orientation, was gay. Most of us would say, this really doesn't constitute an acceptable basis for moral difference. Certainly not for inferior treatment. Now, the real question is, are the differences that we can perceive within and between species morally relevant? Should they affect how we treat them? The importance of this, I hope, will become clearer. Now, what I want to do is to look at the principal differences. 6 of them: non-rational beings, linguistically deficient, not moral agents, soulless beings, naturally slaves, devoid of the divine image. I want to look at these, and not necessarily in that order. So we can look precisely at these differences and see whether they should affect our moral treatment of animals. First then, the idea that animals are naturally our slaves. Well, the idea certainly predates the Christian tradition. It was Aristotle who wrote about how, since, I quote, nature makes nothing to no purpose, it must follow that it, that is nature, has made them, that is animals and plants, for the sake of man. Predating the Christian tradition, coming into the Christian tradition predominantly through St. Thomas Aquinas, so that we have an intellectual hierarchy through which we have come to view the world. A hierarchy, of course, based on reason. And it goes something like this: men, women, slaves, okay? Animals, plants. Now, something like this hierarchy, in some form or another, has dominated our perception of nature. And of course, if you're a Christian, you add, the top, angels and God. But it's intellectual hierarchy. And according to Aquinas, who kind of baptizes Aristotelian thought, God has actually made it that way. You see, the Aristotelian argument isn't a naturalistic argument. That's just how it is. But in Aquinas, it comes that it ought. That's how it ought to be because that's how God made it. Now, even if you believe that, namely that animals are naturally our slaves, of course the argument doesn't quite follow in its own terms, because even the rational ruler should morally care for the good of those who are subject to him, and it is a him, of course. And in Christian terms, it's very odd indeed to argue that power should be its own kind of self-justification, especially since there's so much incarnational theology which suggests the reverse, that the power of God is expressed in service, sacrifice, concern of the higher for the lower. Now, again, let's extend this line of thought. Animals are brutes, dumb, non-rational. Now, those brought up within the Western Christian tradition know this language only too well. Brutes, those dumb brutes that hath not understanding, coming of course from the Book of Common Prayer, I always wondered which dumb brutes they were really talking about, but it seems, the exegesis seems to show that these are animals they had in mind. Brutes, dumb, non-rational. Indeed, even the Blue Cross was founded in the turn of the last century or two, or what was it, 901, Our Dumb Friends League. Now again, we have rational hierarchy. Reason should rule, and animals are thought to be utterly lacking in that department. But you see, supposing that argument is true, supposing for a moment that argument is actually true, I don't think it is, but let's suppose it is. Does it follow that rational comprehension always or generally heightens suffering? I don't think so. Since rational incomprehension can also increase suffering. Take, for example, a primate, non-human primate, taken from the forests of Africa, subject to experiments in a laboratory. Well, that being doesn't know why it's been captured, or transported, or subject to experiments. The very lack of understanding means he or she simply experiences the raw terror of what happens. I mean, if you read Terry Waite's book, Taken on Trust, His Years in Captivity, you'll see how he had various mental devices for avoiding the terror and the suffering he had to undergo, one of which, for example, was writing novels in his head. Well, such intellectual comprehension, such intellectual compensations, rather, are denied, aren't they, to most animals? They don't know why they suffer. They don't know. In the case of human-inflicted suffering, they don't know why they suffer or for what purpose. Thirdly, animals don't have language. They're different from us. They don't speak. They are, in the words of one philosopher I've had occasion to debate these matters with, Michael Leahy, they are, quote, linguistically deficient, primitive beings. Well, it's certainly true, there's no point pretending about it, pretending otherwise, that language does unlock a richness of experience that humans cannot share. On the other hand, of course, animals may well have their own intense, symbolic and other language which we cannot enter into. If pigeons cannot understand our language, we certainly cannot understand theirs. But the really key question is, even if this is true, and they cannot speak human language, despite Washoe the chimp and so on and so forth, does that make their pain less painful or matter less? I don't think so. The fact that a child cannot understand, for example, teething, does that make it their pain less easy to bear? As a father of four, I think not. And also, and this is really quite important, if they are linguistically deficient, as is often supposed, it follows that animals cannot consent. Now, this is a very obvious point, but it really has to be stressed. You see, a great deal of ethics, human-devised ethics at least, focuses rightly on consent. After all, consent makes the difference between consensual sex and rape. Consent, for example, in experimentation, now often regarded as termed informed consent, is precisely there to prevent the trampling of the rights of the individual since the Declaration of Helsinki. Consent is a key category, but of course it follows animals can never consent. They never give up their lives. They have their lives taken away. They don't say, here I am, I want to be eaten. You know, I'm waiting for Christmas, I'm waiting for the butchers. They can't consent. They have no capacity to consent. Fourthly, the idea that animals are not moral agents. Basically, they have no moral duties. They are not morally responsible, they are not capable of making decisions, and they do not know the difference between right and wrong. Well, there's been a large amount of philosophic discussion recently about whether animals can show some elements of altruism, especially non-human primates. Well, that may or may not be the case, but even Mark Rowlands, in his book Are Animals Moral, even Mark Rowlands says that it cannot be true that animals are moral agents in the sense that they think about right and wrong and then make a deliberative choice. They are moral patients rather than moral agents. Moral patients in the sense that they can suffer moral harm, but they themselves are not agents in the sense of being able to affect moral actions and be responsible for them. Now, that is often widely accepted. But you see, if that's so, some things follow that are often not properly understood. It means that animals are morally blameless. They are morally innocent, which makes the infliction of suffering upon them harder to justify. Animals can never merit pain or deserve pain or be improved by it. Let me give you an example. Some people, I don't think I'm one of them, but some people believe that there should be prison or a penal system because it may in some way rehabilitate, educate, change the person who's committed one or more horrible acts so they become a better person. And that therefore punishment must include an element of pain, at least deprivation and some suffering. I'm not sure I believe that, but even if you believe that, even that is not an explanation or justification that could apply to animals. And why not? Because of course animals cannot be morally improved by pain. And even though we may train our dog to do one thing or another, we are not, as it were, improving them, we are just indicating the limits of what we can bear in our household. This is a very key point. Animals can never merit pain. They can never deserve it. They can never be improved by it, which is one of the reasons why animal suffering remains, so difficult to justify. There are two theological justifications, and then I'm almost finished. It's often the case in Latin American countries that people say, well, animals, they don't have souls. They don't have souls. In fact, Catholic tradition has never denied that animals have souls. There are three kinds of souls in classic Thomist thought. Rational souls for humans, animated souls for animals, and vegetative souls for vegetables. Okay? Now, it is only, however, human beings that have incorporeal, rational souls, and it is only these that are thought to be immortal. Okay? And that has been the key distinction. I'm sure you can see the logic of it. Animals don't have reason, therefore they can't really feel like us, therefore they can't have a conception of themselves, and they can't have soul, and so on and so forth. Now, supposing all that's true, I myself am inclined to the view that animals will certainly be in heaven, but most human beings I've met certainly won't be, but that's my point of view. That's only my opinion. But you see, supposing for a moment they don't have souls, logically it makes the infliction of suffering upon them even more intolerable, since they're not going to be recompensed in a future life. I'm sure you see the logic. It's really quite simple. It just means that what they suffer now, it's ghastly and it's the end. Whereas some of us think it's ghastly and then there might be something else. But you can't use that kind of argument in relation to animals. And it's hardly an argument, is it, for treating animal suffering as somehow less important. Now, sixthly, only human beings have got the divine image. I'm sure we've all heard this. I mean, religious people love this. You know, we are made in the image of God, therefore we are qualitatively different. You know, our suffering is vastly more important. Our intelligence is enormous, and so on and so forth. Now, in fact, if you look at Genesis 1, if you look closely at Genesis 1 and the biblical theology behind it, one discovers a rather different picture. Image and dominion go together in Genesis 1, which means that we are the species commissioned to care for the earth as God wants us to do. Now, this isn't, the Linzey view, the modern revisionist Linzey view. It is actually the view of the text too. You see, 26, 27, we're made in the image of God. We all remember that. 28, 29, given dominion, we all remember that. 29 to 30, we're given a vegetarian diet, which is only reversed after the fall and the flood in Genesis 9:3. No one remembers that, do they? No. Even I didn't realise it was there for years. So, not eating animals, having dominion over them, but not even killing them, is hardly a license. Well, herb-eating dominion is hardly a license for tyranny, is it? Again, being made in the image of God, who is holy, loving, just, is hardly a basis for behaving in a morally inferior way, is it, to animals? I mean, just think of it. It'd be much better, easier to organise, to argue, we're made in the image of Satan, therefore we can beat up other animals. On the contrary, the theology of Genesis 1 is that we are to behave in a godlike way to God's other creatures. And this insight about vegetarianism and peace in Genesis 1 is terribly important. And it isn't just a matter of selective reading of Scripture. It's terribly important because the people who wrote Genesis 1 weren't vegetarians. They weren't opposed to capital punishment. They weren't pacifists. They weren't even opposed to genocide. And yet they had this single insight that God had created or intended to create a world that was initially non-violent. And that, I think, is so interesting and significant for modern debates about animal rights. Now, I'm coming shortly to the end. I have just a few more things to say. The question is this: do any of these differences, even accepting that they are true, provide grounds for exercising less moral solicitude to animals? The fact they can't talk, the fact they can't understand, the fact they may not have a soul, the fact that we're made in the image of God. Now, does any of this constitute moral relevance? I don't think so. Perhaps in the case of rationality, I mean, obviously, when I say unpleasant things about my cat, not very often, but when I do, I don't think she understands the full nature of the insult because she doesn't understand my language. On the other hand, there are ways in which animals can be hurt in ways in which human beings can't. Let us extend, for example, the point I raised earlier about captive animals. What do they suffer? They suffer what has been called a harm of deprivation. It is what they are deprived of by nature of being an animal. In the case of wild animals, so called, their capacity to be alive and free. Something really rather central to their animality. But otherwise, I cannot see that any of these so-called differences, so obviously appealed to throughout the classical literature and throughout philosophy and theology, can justify any of our moral differential treatment. On the contrary, these differences provide the rational grounds, and here I'm getting to the guts, the rational grounds for caring for animals. Why should we care for animals? No, it's not about liking them or disliking them. It's about the fact that they're blameless morally. They cannot give or withhold their consent. They cannot represent themselves. They cannot comprehend what the hell we're doing to them in most cases. And finally, they're vulnerable and dependent. I think these are rational considerations. And when someone says, well, why the hell should you care for animals? My answer is, these are the objective reasons why we should care. It's not about whether you like certain forms of animals or detest others. I mean, some people say, why did God create hedgehogs? Or, what on earth is the point of frogs or wasps? It's not about what we feel. These are objective, rational reasons for caring for animals. Now, Here comes the theological twist. You see, being trained as a theologian, I like theological arguments. And here's a theological argument that I think is pretty ballsy, as I think there's a... Now, if you ask the question, why should the suffering of innocent, vulnerable, uncomprehended, and undefended sentient beings matter theologically? I know what you're going to say. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, ah, yes, Andrew. It was answered decisively in a sermon by John Henry Newman in 1842 on Good Friday, when he was vicar of St. Mary's University Church in Oxford. And this is what he says. He's preaching from Isaiah, which compares our Lord's suffering to a lamb. And he says this: I mean, consider how very horrible it is to read accounts which sometimes meet us of cruelties exercised on brute animals. Does it not sometimes make us shudder to hear tell of them, or to read them in some chance publication which we may take up? At one time it is the wanton deed of barbarous and angry owners who ill-treat their cattle or beasts of burden, and at another it is the cold-blooded and calculating act of men of science who make experiments on brute animals, perhaps merely from a sort of curiosity. He goes on, I do not like to go into particulars for many reasons, but one of those instances which we read of as happening this day, and which seems more shocking than the rest, is when this poor dumb victim is fastened against a wall, pierced, gashed, and so left to linger out its life. Now, do you not see that I am not using these distressing words for nothing? For what was this but the very cruelty inflicted upon our Lord? I repeat, for what was this but the very cruelty inflicted upon our Lord? Now, what is it that moves our very hearts and sickens us so much as cruelty shown to the poor brutes? I suppose this first, that they have done no harm. Second, that they have no power whatever of resistance. It is the cowardice and tyranny of which they are the victims that make their sufferings so especially touching. There is something so dreadful, so satanic, his word, not mine, so satanic in tormenting those who have never harmed us and who cannot defend themselves, who are utterly in our power, who have weapons neither of offence nor defence, that none but the very hardened persons can endure the thought of it. Now, he concludes, this was just our Saviour's case. Concludes the sermon, think then, my brethren, of your feelings of cruelty practised upon brute animals, and you will gain one sort of feeling which the history of Christ's cross and passion ought to excite within you. So there's the thesis then. There is a Christ-like suffering of animals. Now this is John Henry Newman, hardly some radical modern liberation theologian. Now, I want to end then by making what I'm sure many of you will find a most difficult and provoking analogy, but I have to. Over the last 20, 30, 40 years, there has been increased sensitivity to the rights of children, to the suffering of children. It's come late in history. After all, the Declaration on the Rights of the Child is 1979. It's taken a long time to get to the rights of the child, and the Christian tradition has more justified the rights of parents rather than underwritten the rights of children. But nevertheless, if you ask yourself, Is this kind of sentimentality that's concerned for children? Child cruelty or abuse? Surely not. Surely what we would want to say is there's a rational basis for being concerned about children, and it goes like this. They're morally innocent. They can't comprehend. They can't consent. They can't know what's happening. They're vulnerable and dependent. Now, I want to suggest to you that if those arguments are good, and I think they are good, they apply not just to children. So, here we have it then. When analysed as impartially as possible, bearing in mind human beings are almost incapable of being truly impartial where their own interests are concerned, but nevertheless, when analysed as impartially as possible, and insofar as they are morally relevant, the differences between animals and humans work more in favour of non-human animals than against them. And they provide a grounds for more, not less, moral solicitude. That is my email and that is my web address, just in case you would like to contact me, and I thank you for being such a generous and patient audience. There is one particular species that is out of control, that is causing environmental mess everywhere. It's a species that seemingly has no capacity to exercise control over itself. It's a species apparently that is taking over the world and is projected to take over more and more of the world, so there will be fewer and fewer other species. Since you believe in balance and culling, do you think that species should be culled as well?
Are you saying that we should have some sort of population control?
No, what I'm saying is it's very difficult, I think, for a species that has shown itself so incapable of controlling its own population to say to other species how many there should be, where they should live, and in what numbers. You know, we are supposed to be the rational species who can't actually yet rationally control our own. We cannot even stop overfishing in the ocean so that those people who want to eat fish will be able to do so in the future. Do you think that if a species landed on Earth that regarded itself as more developed in relation to us as we do in relation to other animals, that they should also have a certain license to use us? There's now a great deal of empirical evidence. Outside you will see a book called The Link Between Animal Abuse and Human Violence. And it shows the accumulation of evidence, medical, statistical, psychological. The human beings themselves are damaged by the abuse of animals. And more than that, that the inability to relate or have empathy to animals actually indicates a psychological disorder. Now, this isn't Andrew Linzey, this is the FBI. At the conference we held in Oxford 3 or 4 years ago, the FBI man came and explained how animal cruelty is one of the diagnostic criteria for dangerousness. And they learnt about the connection by interviewing serial killers and murderers and their own history in the 1970s. And since then, there has been even more evidence accumulating of how those people who cannot somehow emotionally relate to animals or have a deficit of empathy invariably go on to commit antisocial or violent acts to human beings. You see, it's very possible for us to have what I can only call blinkered vision, or to live in denial. It's terribly difficult, in a way, to be giving this lecture at all. I feel, as I was saying on the car coming here, it's like preaching the French Revolution to the French bourgeoisie. You know, most human beings who live have an interest in not taking what I have to say seriously, because they know that whenever I start talking about the interests of animals, animal suffering, animal rights, the people will think, uh-oh, this may have some implications for my leather shoes and what I'm going to have for breakfast, and or it might have some impact on what I'm going to buy in the supermarket. Do I really want to hear this? Now, human beings, all of us, including myself, have a capacity to simply blinker off things they don't want to. And in the case of medical research in general, the scientist is concerned solely with solving that problem, not with the moral status of the rat or the suffering of the rat, but principally geared to that, focused on that issue. Do you see things? So the moral question I have to ask is, yes, these may well be sincere, honourable people pursuing medical research to the best of their lights, concerned specifically with human suffering. But the question I have to ask is, why should always animals bear the cost? My position is this. It's not always wrong to kill an animal. It can be justified in the case of euthanasia, both for humans and animals, and in the case of self-defense, both for humans and animals. So I'm not an absolutist about killing animals, but I am an absolutist about the infliction of suffering. And I believe the infliction of suffering, except when it is for that individual animal, for example, who's taken to a vet, may undergo some discomfort or pain, except when it's for that individual animal, I'm against causing suffering from one to the other, for the other. That's why, if I'm against torture, Salman bin Laden can be sitting here and I would not vote to torture him. I believe that there are certain things that human beings should never do, and one of them is the deliberate infliction of suffering on animals or humans. And one of the reasons I say that, very briefly, is I'm not a utilitarian. Now, there are some people like Peter Singer who are very pro-animals, who will still say, well, if 10 rabbits have to suffer in order to save another 100, we vivisect the 10. And that's his view right across the board, because he is a utilitarian, a preference utilitarian. I'm not one of those people. I think there are times, and I know it's a very dangerous and difficult thing to say this, in a world which doesn't really admit of any moral boundaries at all, but I think the boundaries should be placed at the question of suffering and torture. I'm afraid the evidence isn't with you. It's 60% or so that are performed without analgesics. The majority of, indeed the Home Office itself, has 3 bands of suffering. It's, It's severe, moderate, acceptable. Severe suffering is allowed in laboratories. It's monitored by the Animal Procedures Committee. But severe experiments are allowed. Not all experiments are severe, but some are. I believe in progressive disengagement from injury to animals. On one hand, I accept we're in a mess. A lot of what we do, if not almost all of it, to animals is morally beyond the pale. Okay? But we need to get out of it as much as we can. There's no pure land, there's none of us here free from animal exploitation, either through the food you eat, the products you buy, or the taxes you pay. We're all impure. There's no pure land, and I'm certainly not claiming any purity myself. But what I am saying is that we should not despair, we should seek a program of progressive disengagement from injury to animals. You know, for some people this will mean not supporting hunting or not shooting. For other people it will mean not buying factory farm produce. For other people it will mean being vegetarian, or cutting down on meat, or being a vegan. Whatever it is, it's important that we make some movement along that road. We don't all have to agree on the same steps. We don't all have to agree, but it is very important that we move people along. You know, if only you can buy free-range eggs, at least that saves a few battery chickens from suffering. And I mean, if you can only manage to oppose blood sports, well, you know, to see the end of blood sports in my lifetime would be a really good thing. So my view is not veganism or nothing. That is not my view. My view is let's encourage one another to move into less exploitative, less violent lifestyles. Let me try and give you some practical scenarios, can I? We've used all our technology, all our ingenuity to enslave and use animals. Take, for example, factory farming. I'm old enough to remember that factory farming was once lauded as technological ingenuity. You know, we get more bang for our bucks, we get more eggs out the hens, you know. We used all our ingenuity to imprison animals, literally so they could hardly move, but they would produce more eggs. Now we're realizing, after a great deal of work and some moral intuition, that this was actually a cruel system. The truth is, we could use our technology and our knowledge to produce farming that is genuinely more humane and animal friendly. I realise we're not going to go vegetarian tonight, but we could actually use our knowledge to enable our scientific knowledge to actually improve the lives of existing farm animals enormously.
But what happens if the population increases and we need more eggs quickly?
Yes, well, this is the big argument for vegetarianism. The big argument for vegetarianism is that animals are protein systems in reverse. We feed the soya that can feed people directly to animals. Whereas, so it's an inefficient source of protein. Let me give you yet another example. We mustn't allow ourselves to be, as it were, despondent. Let me give you another example. I have some reservations about this, but have you heard of in vitro meat? Well, it's now possible by a couple of cells to actually grow living flesh, but it is not sentient because there is no brain. Now, I understand that it's now possible by a few cells from the slaughterhouse to actually create and market, you know, huge masses of I won't say non-animal, but certainly non-sentient animal protein. Now, I believe in the future that just think, for example, of the substitutes for meat. I mean, when I became a vegetarian in the 60s, it was dire, my friends, dire. I mean, there was nothing to eat. Now you go even into Tesco's and you see all this array of meat substitutes, and you know, some of it's not bad. Some of it is edible. Not all of it, but some of it is edible. I promise you. And my children have been brought up on a lot of it, and they like some of it. Now look, you see, necessity is the mother of invention. Once you start saying, no, we can't have cruel factory farm systems. No, we've got to have real alternatives to meat. No, there must be a better way. Lo and behold, capitalists, wicked capitalists, and entrepreneurs find the answer because they always follow demand. We can be part of the answer by simply creating the demand. Veganism as a philosophy, if you read the literature, is not just concerned about living without killing, it's about living without all the byproducts of slaughter. Okay? It's not just about not eating cheese or eggs or whatever. It's a philosophy that says we're going to live off byproducts, all animal byproducts. Well, here's the bad news. It's not possible. I mean, let me give you an example. Only the other day, I was reading about how the slaughtered pig gives rise to 100 byproducts, including pottery and ceramics and film and goodness knows what. Wow! You know, they've certainly found ways of using a dead pig. Now, it's quite impossible for any human being not to be involved in that. Let me give you another example. Supposing you go home and your house is on fire, do you not use a fire extinguisher substance? All fire extinguisher substances have been tested for their toxicity on animals. Even if you only eat soybeans as a vegan, soybeans have been tested for their toxicity on animals. There is no pure land. And some people, in the light of that, despair, go back to eating meat, or some become, I'm sorry to say this, vegan police. They police others and police themselves, and they spend their whole life concerned with what they're going to buy or what they're not going to buy. Now, I think there has to be a frank recognition that all these things, vegetarianism, reducing, eating less meat, abolishing hunting, all these things are steps towards. I sometimes say to people that God didn't intend people to live in England. Only intended the wild beasts to live here. Nobody in their right mind would live in such a cold, dark, dank climate like the one we have to experience in Oxford. What was that Roman general who reported back on his first visit to England? The people here seem pleasant and industrious enough, but the land is in permanent grip of winter. Well, I know what that means. But very seriously, human beings who want to live in cultures that are perilous like that can only do so at the expense of animal and other life. But that does beg a question as to whether or not they have a right. Human beings have a right to live everywhere. For myself, I think Jesus showed us the way. Middle East only, but nevertheless, we're now everywhere. Do you see, we're human beings now everywhere. We think that the world is unfair when it doesn't give us everything we want everywhere in the world. Do you see, what are these elephants doing here? What right have they to be here? They shouldn't be here. Well, actually, their ancestors were here before us, and they used to enjoy roaming throughout the whole of Africa. Now we try to put them in little nature reserves. But actually, elephants roam the whole of Africa. It's we who have constrained their life without constraining our own. Well, this is the point at which in animal and eco gatherings people boo at me. They boo at me because I refer to my 4 children. You see?
But you're not culling any of them.
Well, the culling would really be about my wife culling me, I think. But I speak here as another impure person who hasn't made it to the dizzy heights. But I would like to say this. If you want animal rights, you can't simply envisage a situation whereby more and more and more human beings are born and they all have their inalienable rights to land and food and transport and clothing and hospitals. More and more human rights means the end of animal rights, and eventually more and more human rights and more humans mean the end of the earth. I'm sorry, but the resources are finite, and that's why, despite the fact that they're not politically very anyone's favourite, the Green Party is articulating something of vital significance to the human beings and our society, namely that we can't just go on consuming finite resources. Growth in that sense is an illusion if there's no planet left. I'm sorry to be so simplistic, but I think the issue of growth is terribly important and needs to be addressed in a more creative way.